Hello everyone, thanks for joining us. Welcome to another Eurocontrol Aviation Straight Talk Live. I'm Andrew Charlton. This is the program where we talk about what's going on in the aviation industry, and importantly, we talk about how we build back better and what better might look like once we've built back to it. We talk to all sorts of people across the aviation ecosystem. Today we're talking specifically about airports, and more importantly than that, talking about Heathrow Airport, what used to be Europe's largest airport, of course. And I'm delighted to say that we're welcoming the CEO of Heathrow, Mr. Holland, Kaye. But first, as ever, in Straight Talk, I'd like to ask the Director General of Eurocontrol, Mr. Raymond Brennan, if he'd be so kind as to bring us up to date with what's going on in the market. Raymond, thanks very much.
Good afternoon from Brussels, and a special hello to Andrew and Holland, Kaye, the CEO of London Heathrow, who's in the studio with us here today. Really looking forward to an exciting interview afterwards. As usual, I'm trying to give you an update of where we are, and it's after Easter, and it's time maybe just to have a quick look at how things have evolved over the last number of days. So as you can see, the trend has been very much static over the last week or so, but if we're just looking at Monday, for instance, in the network, we had a reduction of 64%. Only 11,280 flights, and that's a really significant reduction, Easter aside, since 2019. So we're still really in the midst of this pandemic, and we're not seeing any vaccine bounce in Europe at the moment. I think it's also important to look at airports, and as today we're talking to John, look at where London Heathrow is. A 75% reduction in aircraft movements since 2019. Really significant, much more in passengers, and I'm sure John will outline to you the reasons for all of this, but it's really unsustainable. If we look at the airports in Europe at the moment, all of the major hub airports have been severely impacted, and I would also make the point that there are small regional airports throughout the United Kingdom, throughout Italy, throughout Greece, that are really suffering as a result of this pandemic. And I'm not sure that some of them have the financial strength to maintain and sustain and come back if we don't see some recovery soon. So I think it's a big challenge. Heathrow, has had a very, very difficult year. And if we look here at the moving chart, you can see a big initial fall, a recovery throughout the summer to modest levels, and a further fall as we got more lockdowns in the United Kingdom and as we got second and third waves of CV hitting Europe. So really, the UK has been really significantly impacted. It's the second largest fall in Europe from a state point of view in air traffic in 2020. Also, it's worth looking at Heathrow. If you, for instance, look at the largest airline operating in Heathrow, British Airways, an 84% reduction. Effectively, BA are just operating cargo at the moment. The same with Virgin Atlantic, limited operations. And you can also see the markets. The United States operating, internal operations in the United Kingdom are there, but operations to places like Ireland, which will be a large market normally, have virtually ceased. So really, it's very, very difficult for a hub airport like Heathrow. And as John will explain to you, they've taken very significant action like closing terminals, restricting runways, trying to save costs. But really, this is very difficult. And as he said in a recent interview, the UK economy will not recover until Heathrow recovers. And I think that that's really important. Yesterday, we had the top 10 aircraft operators in Europe. So if you look at, for instance, Monday, you can see all of them very significantly down. Interestingly, looking at the top 10, John's major customer, British Airways, don't feature there, which really shows you the impact that this has had on London Heathrow. And that is really, really important. So you can see that, it's been a very difficult week for operators, but we would hope that things will improve in the months ahead. Looking at the market segments, and there you've got a lovely view of the proposed new runway at Heathrow, and I'm sure John and Andrew will touch on this as part of their discussion. But I think what's important to see is that it has gone right through the whole sector. Low costs have been impacted. John's main markets in London Heathrow, traditional, have reduced by 67%. That's legacy, hub and spoke. Business aviation is down 22%. And the only sector that's improved has, of course, been cargo. And we hopefully, in the months ahead, will see an improvement. In Eurocontrol, we do see an improvement coming from the end of May. And we see that the months of June, July and August, we see a significant return to growth. But we believe that it will be after September before long haul or anything of that nature starts coming back. So in practical terms, the big game changer for the United Kingdom has been the effective rollout of vaccines. It's amongst the best in the world. It's definitely the leading one in Europe. And when you see this offers opportunity, and I believe that this will offer opportunity for airports like Heathrow, for operations to Spain, to Southern Europe, to some of the sun destinations throughout the summer. And already a number of airlines have told us that they have seen up to 20% increase in their booking engines for the months of June, July and August. So I'm optimistic that the UK market will start returning to some form of normality this summer, but obviously it'll be next year before we get a full recovery. But the vaccine generally is good news. But remember, like John and others have said, the vaccine isn't really much use unless it's rolled out all over Europe. And it's important that we adopt a green passport. In other words, if you're vaccinated, you're not subject to quarantines and you're not subject to overly rigorous restrictions. This to us is really important. So I think that if we look at the outlook for London Heathrow, you know, with 22 million passengers in 2020, when you compare that to 81 million in 2019, this year is going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult on finances. But the optimistic thing I'm saying for the UK is this week, the travel restrictions, or should I say the quarantine restrictions, etc., have improved a lot. We've seen the opening up of some outlets, and leisure and hospitality has opened. This does offer opportunity, particularly as the vaccines roll out. So I think it's important that once by mid-May we get further relaxations, I think you will see significant increased demand coming from the UK. I believe there's a bottle of demand ready to go there that will move in June, July and August and will help kickstart aviation. But it's important that we all realise that, you know, vaccinations is the most important thing and we need to get there. And I'm looking forward to the discussion on, of course, the third runway at Heathrow and all that. Just before I end, I want to say that continuing with our CEO series, we have up next Sean Doyle, the CEO of British Airways, then Kadri Samsunlo, the CEO of Istanbul, and later on Tony Douglas, the CEO of Etihad. But that's it for me now, and it's back to Andrew and John in the studio. I hope you have a really, really good interview. I'm really looking forward to it, and thank you very much.
John, welcome to Straight Talk. Thanks for joining us. Fairly grim pictures there in Eamon's presentation. How do you see the situation at the moment, and how do you see the situation in the next little while?
Well, as Eamon put very well, things are very tough for all of us in the aviation sector. And from an airport point of view, it's particularly challenging. We are big infrastructure businesses. We have about £16 billion of assets at Heathrow that we need to maintain and keep running, keep safe and secure. And just because we have no passengers doesn't mean that we can reduce our costs proportionately. So we're struggling with a revenue side which depends entirely upon passenger numbers coming through, and a cost side which is independent of passengers. And that's why we are losing £5 million a day. And Eamon's absolutely right. This is just not sustainable for airports in the long term. And unless we get a strong summer, then I think many airports around Europe will really struggle to survive, as will some airlines as well. So getting passengers back and flying for the summer is crucial for all of us. Now, we've taken steps to try to protect ourselves. Eamon talked about some of the cost-saving measures we have put in place, things I never imagined that we would have to do, trying to protect jobs as much as we can, but we have had job cuts, cutting people's pay, which is not something that anyone would expect that we would have to do, renegotiating all of our contracts. That has helped us to reduce our cost base, but still it is largely fixed. So that is a real challenge for us. And from a revenue point of view, we are doing everything we can to get people back flying again, as long as it is safe to do so. And we know that international travel is a vector for carrying this virus around the world. So we do need to be very responsible about the measures we take to get people flying. But until we get people flying again, we won't have a business. And so there's a difficult balance that we all have to make in our work with government to make sure that we're not pushing people to go too far and too fast, but equally, we're not encouraging them to be too cautious, because governments have to balance the economic needs with the health issues. And I think we're coming close to a tipping point for that.
Right. Can we spend a few moments on that if we could, perhaps? We've obviously got testing and we've got vaccines. Do you see the future, as Eamon put it, in the vaccines? I mean, will we continue to need testing after the vaccines are rolled out across Europe, for example?
I think over the next year, maybe 2 years, we're going to have a combination of the two. Vaccination rates are moving at different paces in different parts of the world, as we know. And what I hope we'll get to is that testing is an alternative to a vaccine. So as we've seen in the United States, the Center for Disease Control has said that if you've been vaccinated, you don't need to be tested as well. Well, that's a really good step forward. We've not seen the same happening in all European countries as well. But I think if we can establish that, then it starts to reduce the burden on passengers and on airport and airline and border force operators to make sure that people can get closer to travel as it used to be.
So, so I take from that you're quite in favour of vaccine certificates. Let's not call them passports, vaccine certificates. The other thing, of course, which many of the health professionals say is that nobody's vaccinated until everybody's vaccinated. So does that mean that we're still looking at a 2 or 3 year flight path to recovery?
Realistically, it is going to take a couple of years before we get back to some kind of normality. And the nature of international travel is that you've got to think about both ends of the route. And if you've got a country like the UK with very high vaccination levels, unless the UK government is confident about vaccination levels or the risk of importing COVID from overseas, then they're not going to open their borders with other countries. And that's why I think over the summer, we're going to see quite a patchy opening up of international travel, which I hope will progressively improve. But we have to be guided by the science. People are still learning about vaccination and to what extent it provides immunity for the individual, and whether the individual can still carry COVID even if they have been vaccinated. And I think that over the next few months, we will learn more about this. But what we've seen is that governments will be very cautious about opening up international travel. And as much as possible, we should be encouraging them to have some commonality in the way in which they do this, some standardization, because that makes it easier for individual passengers to know what the requirements are going to be on them. It makes it much easier for all of us in the aviation sector to make sure that we can comply with the rules and make sure that we can keep people safe as they are flying.
Well, indeed. But interestingly, in that mix, of course, the obligation on the passengers is for a test of some description, or either the vaccination or a test, or a combination of those two. And a family of 4 with vaccination testing at both ends can be quite a sum of money. Your old sparring partner, Mr. Willie Walsh, formerly of BA and then IAG, of course, is now the head of IATA, came out in his first pronouncement as the head of IATA that airlines weren't going to pay for testing. He'd be quite happy for the airports to pay for testing. That was at least the impression I got. You got any thoughts on that?
Well, I think ultimately it will be either individuals or governments who pay for testing. And of course, anything that we all incur as an aviation sector will get passed on to the customer in the end. But certainly in the UK, the expectation is that it'll be the passenger who pays for testing. And that's why we need to be careful that in layering on new levels of tests, some of which have a very high cost, we don't make travel prohibitively expensive for people to take on. And so I think something we're all concerned about is that first of all, the governments aren't have an appropriate level of risk assessment, and they're not too cautious. And I think in the UK, the debate is around the extent to which people need to have PCR tests before they fly and after they fly as part of a a safety system, and we can perhaps talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But the second thing is that we don't embed some of these new measures into international travel in the way we did with a lot of security measures post 9/11. And if we institutionalized that people had to take PCR tests wherever they were flying, that would be a nonsense, I think, for most people in the long term. We might all consider that it's a fair thing to do in the short term over the next 12 to 24 months while the pandemic is being brought under control. But if we were still doing that in a world where there wasn't the risk of COVID every day as there is now, I think most people would see that as being completely over controlling by governments.
Have you needed to change the shape of the airport for things like testing and social distancing and things like that?
We have as much as we can. And of course, this isn't just about the space that passengers use, it's also the colleagues working around the airport, making sure that restrooms, for example, are set up in a way that allows people to socially distance while they're taking a break. And these are enormously challenging things to do because we still have tens of thousands of people working on the airport every day, even though we have very few people actually traveling. We probably have more people working there than are actually flying, just keeping the airport safe and secure and maintaining all of the equipment. So they need to be looked after just as much as our passengers do. But we cannot reconfigure the entire airport because of some of the changes that have been brought in on a very short-term basis. And one of the biggest pinch points is at immigration, where which is a critical bottleneck for checking that passengers have complied with all the regulations that are put in place by governments. Now, these are already checked when people are going through the check-in process, and many of these things are checked online beforehand. But if governments are going to insist on manual checks as well on all passengers as they come through the border, that is going to massively increase the transaction times at the border, which will lead to queues. We cannot build new immigration halls or increase the space. And just at Heathrow, even with only a handful of passengers arriving each day, there have been some days when we've had queues of up to 6.5 hours. You know, that's nobody queues for that long for anything. And that is just an unacceptable level of queuing. And what it comes down to is that there is not enough resource within Border Force on the day to match the level of demands that government is putting on them. And something needs to change if we are going to give people a good experience as they arrive at the airport and make sure that the aviation sector can flow. And this is currently an issue in the UK. I'm sure the same issue applies in all other countries as well.
And of course, it goes without saying that if you wait 6.5 hours for Border Force to sort you, that's still Heathrow's problem as far as the passengers are concerned. So
well, it is, and you know, this is quite an important point, I think, for airport operators. We employ 7,000 people out of 75,000 people at the airport, and most of the remaining people aren't contracted to us. And yet anyone traveling through the airport sees us as being responsible for their journey, whatever might happen, and whoever's responsibility it is. Yeah. And if you're a passenger, you don't want to, you want someone you can go to when something goes wrong, and you want them to stand up and be accountable. And that's the approach that we take at Heathrow. So even if it is a handler who lets somebody down or Border Force, we will step up and take accountability for that. But we then need to hold those people who have failed in the service to stand up and be accountable as well, and to do something about it. And that's why it's so important that we get Border Force to really step up and make sure that as passenger numbers increase, we can deliver a fantastic service for people arriving in the UK.
Are you confident that the government understands that, and are they responsive to your pleas?
I don't think we're there yet, and I think we've had too many bad experiences over the last year and in previous years to be confident that this is solved. And so I think of all the parts of the airport journey that we're thinking of as we plan for ramp up, this is the one we are most concerned about.
Right, and of course it's by definition outside your control, and it's the government that's doing it. Do you think the government understands the whole nobody's vaccinated till everybody's vaccinated point? Or I get the impression in the UK that they're really focused on their traffic light system and they're going to let the Britons travel all over Europe if they can. So that's a warning to everybody else in Europe. But they don't seem all that interested on the return segment. Is that your impression?
No, not at all. I think they're very concerned about bringing COVID in from overseas, either with Brits returning from overseas travel or from visitors to the UK bringing it in. And that's why we have the traffic light system. And it's actually a very sensible approach to say that not all countries have the same risk. Currently, we know there's significant concern about Brazil and South Africa and some other countries. And so we would all expect there to be tighter controls on those countries than there might be on somewhere like Israel or maybe the US, where there's high vaccination levels and the risk is much lower. And that's really what the traffic light system does. And it's a very sensible way of saying, if you're coming from lower risk countries where the risk of catching COVID is no higher than it is in your home country, then you should have a lower level of checks. And what we're waiting to see from the government is which countries will be considered as being low risk, which are medium risk, and which are high risk. And we hope that there will be enough countries in that low risk segment to allow people to start traveling again and to get businesses and families reunited and allow people to go on their holidays, including coming to the UK on their holidays.
Right. I mean, outbreaks are inevitable, but pandemics are optional, I think, is the point of all of that, isn't it? You said earlier that you think there will be fewer airlines in the future. And Eamon and you both said there's a lot of airports under enormous strain at the moment. How do you think the industry will look in 5 years, in 10 years' time?
I think over 10 to 15 years, we will be pretty much back to where we would have been had the pandemic not happened. And what we've seen in a lot of sectors is that activity has been put on hold rather than people fundamentally changing their behaviors. Anytime there is a rumor of markets opening up again, you can see the pent-up demand from passengers reflected in their online searches and their forward bookings for flights. And so I think that when people are allowed to fly again, they will come back quite strongly. And the main constraint really is this government appetite around the world towards risk and opening their borders. And so that is going to be the limitation. And in 5 years' time, I would hope that that constraint has gone away again.
Right.
So I think the outlook for aviation is very good, but we do have to get through the next few years, which will be a bit bumpy. It's remarkable how well people have survived in the last 12 months, given that none of us have had any revenue to speak of. But we've all used up our reserves. We're all running on empty from a financial point of view and from a people point of view. And we need to start rebuilding if we're going to be able to deliver that much more positive future.
Right. Putting things on hold is a perfect segue to talk about the third runway, isn't it? Do you still think we need a third runway? Does Heathrow need a third runway?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see through the pandemic just how resilient the hub model has been. Airlines have concentrated their operations on hub airports. Heathrow, we've seen that, but you can see that in other airports as well. Any long-haul flying has really been cut from point-to-point airports and is reverted to hubs, which are the most viable model for long-haul operation. And so I think as the UK economy recovers, as aviation recovers, the need for a third runway Heathrow will absolutely be there.
What sort of timeframe? What sort of timeframe are we talking?
Well, it's a little bit hard to say, but I think the timeframe for needing it will be shorter than the time it will take to build it. And that's the nature of infrastructure. You need to start building it before the need comes in. This is what the Chinese are fantastic at. They build extra capacity before the need because they know it's coming, and that way they don't run out of vital capacity when they need it. France is pretty good. They wait until they've run out of capacity, then they build it. In the UK, we wait until 20 years after we realize we've run out of capacity and we've exhausted all other options for doing anything about it, and it's only then we get on and build it. And
So
that's the point we are at now.
So given that we're 20, or the UK is 20 years behind, do you also support Gatwick building, or, extending their other runway, their emergency runway? Do you think that London will need more than one extra runway?
Well, we support the need of all airports in the UK and elsewhere to grow. But what Heathrow does is very different to what Gatwick does, as we can see very vividly over the last 12 months. We're the UK's hub airport. If you want to connect the UK to markets all over the world, then you need a healthy Heathrow without the constraints of only 2 runways, which is a massive limitation, even today in what we are able to do. And so if the UK wants to be this vibrant international trading nation, then we need a bigger Heathrow. Expanding any other UK airport won't deliver what Heathrow can deliver. And if we don't expand Heathrow, British people will be flying through Charles de Gaulle or Frankfurt or Amsterdam to get to global markets. And I think for the UK as an independent trading nation, that is an unacceptable outcome, to hand your trading routes over to competitive rivals.
In the short to medium term, though, I mean, I think we all agree significant long-haul flying is at least a year, if not 18 months away, if not 24 months away. But so in the short to medium term, we're actually talking European markets, aren't we, realistically? And in that, some of the great European airlines don't use hubs. They're your Ryanairs, your EasyJets and what have you. Now, in a previous Straight Talk, I was talking to Michael O'Leary from Ryanair, and he made the point that for him to stimulate growth and to get exactly the sorts of benefits you're talking about, he will be talking about costs when he talks to his airport customers. You've come under a lot of criticism recently for increasing your charges at a time when we've surely got to stimulate growth. What do you say to that?
Well, let me go back to the first part of your question, which I completely disagree with. I think if anyone was betting on where we were going to be flying over the next few months, it would be long haul rather than short haul.
Is that right?
And absolutely. I mean, certainly from the UK point of view, Europe is cut off. There is less confidence in being able to fly to Europe in the next few months than there is flying to the US or Israel or the Caribbean or Singapore. And actually, from a hub point of view, having that versatility of being able to serve short haul or long haul, if they're available, different market segments, different price points, is a real strength. And that's one of the reasons why at Heathrow we've been able to survive relatively better than many of our other competitors in the UK under exactly the same constraints. We've just got more market opportunities that we can flex towards. And we still have 60 odd airlines operating out of Heathrow today, most of which are long haul airlines. They may be flying largely cargo at the moment, but they are still operating. And that gives us some resilience that when the long haul markets, many of which are ahead of the game in vaccination, start to open up again, we are ready to go. But if I come back to the point you were getting to, which is about costs, we are a regulated airport. We are price controlled so that we cannot charge as much as the market will bear when times are good. But it also means that when times are bad, we don't have the reserves that we've accumulated to be able to cover all of that downside. And that is the nature of being a regulated airport. We're the only airport in the UK that is regulated in quite that way. And that means that when times are bad, we need to be able to recover some of our costs through the regulatory model, which means that under the formula that the UK has put in place, we need to put our charges up in the short term for certain costs. Now, this isn't airport charges, the passenger charge that goes on your bill. These are some of the additional costs of running the baggage system and things like that. And it was actually the airlines who proposed that we should recover this cost through a 1-year increase in per passenger charges. We'd actually proposed something else which would have smoothed the cost and made sure that there wasn't that impact in the short term. But it was the airlines who proposed this approach. And
but it's the airlines that are complaining, nevertheless, let me assure you.
Well, of course they would. We don't want to have to do this. It's not what we would have chosen. But under regulation, we have to agree with our airlines how we approach this kind of issue. So it is a mutual thing. Now, I would much rather that we were not regulated and that we could take the rough with the smooth. But we have to be able to benefit from the good times, as the airlines can do, as well as covering all these additional costs in the downtimes.
So what's your
And
preferred regulatory model then? Is it the Australian light-handed version, or is it no regulation at all?
I think the Australian model is a very good one and would be much more suitable for this kind of time. And of course, the model was not intended to cover times when you go for a year without any revenue. It anticipated a much more stable level of demand. But we are where we are, and you can't have regulation when it suits you and choose not to have it when it doesn't suit you. You've got to take the rough with the smooth.
Well, indeed, although you seem to be taking the smooth, but then charging more for the rough, though, aren't you? Isn't that the reality of it?
Not at all. All we are doing is recovering a small amount of the our total cost base through certain charges in the way the airlines have proposed that we should do so. So this is a mutual thing. It's what they prefer to do rather than what we would have preferred to do. But I would rather be deregulated or have a different regulatory model than this kind of situation.
Is this the long looked for Brexit benefit, that you can break away from the regulatory model that Europe uses?
Well, the regulatory model is actually a UK construct. It's something that the UK government has chosen. They apply it in a lot of other sectors. It is being very heavily tested at the moment. And this is a real issue because we have to invest for the long term. We have huge assets that are sitting there that we've invested in good faith, using private funding to be able to build it. It's a fantastic airport. And yet at the moment, we can't make the most of it. And even some of the slot regulations work against us. So we have lots of airlines who would like to be able to fly out of Heathrow today, in spite of all the constraints, but they just cannot get slots. And
thank you for raising the slot regulation, my favourite topic.
Yeah,
what are your thoughts on it?
Even with the slot waiver, we are not getting the slots handed back early enough that we can pass them on to somebody else.
Even now,
and that is making it. Even now, there's no obligation for the airlines to do that, other than being good business partners.
Honourable.
But it's not happening in the way that it should do, and that is holding us back from being able to generate revenue from non-incumbent airlines.
That's a scandal, isn't it? I mean, why aren't the airlines
regulation when it suits you?
Well, indeed, why aren't the airlines holding it back, handing back their slots? I understood that was the deal.
Well, that was the deal that was proposed by the World Slot Forum, but it wasn't adopted by the UK, and it does tend to favour incumbent airlines and make it harder for new airlines to come in. And it is what it is. But I go back to my point. You can't just cherry pick the bits of regulation that suit you and complain about the ones that don't suit you. It is a whole package.
So if I can just probe your slot point for a moment more, the airlines that are looking for slots to Heathrow, are they passenger airlines or are they mainly cargo services?
No, they're passenger airlines. And some airlines want to have a large enough slot pool that they can make a viable operation. Some of them just want the certainty that they'll be able to operate. And if slots are being handed back too late, they don't have that.
So
it makes it much harder for us to be able to adapt to changing market situations where suddenly certain countries open up. And unless the incumbent airlines take advantage of that opportunity, we are not able to meet the need that passengers will have to get to those countries.
So a number of things come out of that. My first question is, why do you think the airlines are being so slow in handing back those slots? But I suspect the answer is to hold the competition out. Do you agree with that?
Well, there will be some truth in that for some airlines, but they also have a huge amount of uncertainty. We are waiting for May the 17th to see whether the current ban on international flights is lifted, and if so, to which countries. So at this stage, you can understand why incumbent airlines would hold on to their slots until they just know what the rules are. And this really is where we all need to be working together to have a common plan, because there's no point if just the airports get through this crisis and the airlines collapse, then none of us have a business. We all need to get through this together. So this is actually a time where we need the most collaboration rather than pulling apart, which is what historically the aviation sector has tended to do.
Oh, they're very good at. again, Willie Walsh once said he thought that Heathrow was a Taj Mahal. He would be quite happy with a tent in a field. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, actually, I think Heathrow is a fantastic airport, and the fact that it is voted one of the best airports in Europe and one of the best airports in the world by passengers says a lot. The fact that passengers are prepared to actually pay more to use Heathrow than they're currently charged also says a lot. And the fact that British Airways is able to charge more for the same flight from Heathrow than it is from other London airports tells you that there is a huge demand from passengers. So
how do you know the passengers are prepared to pay more than they're actually being charged, though? How do you know?
Look at the prices of flights to Dublin from Gatwick compared to Heathrow. Even adjusting for any, if you take the airport charge into account, or you take them out, there is a significant price premium for passengers flying from Heathrow. So the premium is there. You can see the fact that airlines are choosing to fly out of Heathrow today, even though it's more expensive than flying from other London airports, which are also fully open. It tells you where the demand is. But of course, we are capped from being able to take advantage of that in the good times, and airlines are able to take that premium. So
Unlike the airlines.
I'm not complaining about that. That is the regulatory model. But it does say that we have something good at Heathrow that people value and are prepared to pay for. And it is a fantastic airport. And there are some things that we do differently to other airports, which we have agreed with our airlines, such as having 95% peer service, more than I think any other airport in Europe. That is a service choice that we have made together with our customers, which is the way you would expect it to. And that seems like a small point, but it is massively better for passenger service, which people value. But it drives a lot of infrastructure on the airport. You have to have more piers, more travelators, more underground rail systems to achieve that level of pier service. And that's the kind of thing that drives up the cost of an airport like Heathrow. But that's a choice that we have made together with our airline customers because we believe that that is what passengers ultimately want. And that is borne out by the fact they choose to use us and pay more to do so.
On a very related point, as we go through the COVID thing, do you think that there'll be a need for more technology, contactless, for example, things like that? How do you see, and that of course will increase your cost base as well, I presume.
Yeah, I think there will be a need for more contactless, and this is something that we've been working on for at least a decade to have the contactless journey, and it's always been held back by regulation, by the technology not quite being there. But I think that this may be a positive that comes out of COVID, that we finally get on and implement this. And this is actually something we've worked very closely with British Airways and IATA on to develop this airport of the future, where once the system has recognized you and linked you to a passport, you don't need to keep on showing your passport and your boarding pass the 7 or 8 times you might normally have to do it. Your face will be your token. And I think this is something that could accelerate coming through COVID. The challenge, of course, is that this is a time when it's very hard to invest in these kinds of systems. Nobody has the cash to invest in the capital or in some of the development work. But this is exactly where regulation should help, because for a regulated asset, we should be able to invest even in the bad times, so that when the good times do start to come back over the next couple of years, we have the resources, the facilities, the services in place to meet those customer needs. And it's not just around that contactless journey. It's also about things like security, where we're just on the cusp of a big change towards 3D scanning for passengers going through security. That's something which will be much better for all of us as we travel. You won't need to take your laptops and liquids out of your bags when you go through, so it'll make it a much quicker and easier journey. But that's going to be a big investment for all airports that people just cannot afford to do right now. And as a regulated airport, we should be ahead of the game in getting on with making this kind of investment, and we should be starting now. But until we get our regulatory model settled down, we just can't do that.
Right. Another area, just we're rapidly running out of time. I could talk about this all day, but Let's just very quickly talk about the environment and sustainability. Heathrow's been right at the forefront of some of that stuff, but isn't the reality that whatever you do for carbon neutrality, the aeroplanes still produce a lot of emissions? What can you do about that?
Well, we all have to do something about this. None of us in the aviation sector will be in business in 30 years' time if we don't decarbonize our sector. This is existential for the planet, but also for the aviation sector. And aviation is a wonderful thing. We all benefit from it. It's connected communities and supports trade and all those things that we know and value. And yet, unless we can decarbonize, we will have to find other slower ways of doing all those things, and the world will go backwards. So it's a simple choice. And so we have been campaigning for several years now for the global aviation sector to decarbonize by 2050, which is the deadline set by the Paris Accord, and to start as quickly as possible. And so we are working with the airlines and other players, energy companies, banks even, to see how we can switch energy supply to lower carbon or zero carbon alternatives. For long haul, that's going to be about sustainable aviation fuel, because that's the only way that we can decarbonize long haul flight by 2050. For short haul, there will be things like electric and maybe some hydrogen starting to come in by then. But for long haul, it has to be about SAF. And that's why we need some urgent action now to start to build up the supply of sustainable aviation fuels. And the fact that we've now got not just the main players in the EU committing to net zero by 2050, we also have the US sector signing up to that. Airlines in the Middle East, in China, or in Hong Kong signing up. That is a fantastic step forward. And what I hope is that we'll be able to get a real groundswell building up to make this a flagship commitment at COP26 in November this year in the UK, ahead of a global agreement at ICAO in September 2022. And that is coming very quickly. So building a momentum behind a commitment and an action plan that involves SAF and changes in technology and also changes in airspace to help us to get to net zero is absolutely vital. And if we miss this window, then we all risk being out of business in the next 30 years.
Right, well, indeed. My final question is always the same, so let me ask you as well. What do you think Eurocontrol can do to improve European aviation and global aviation, for that matter?
Well, I mean, Eurocontrol does a fantastic job. I think there are a couple of things that come to mind. One is there is a role to play in helping to reduce carbon emissions in flight around Europe and through European airspace. Since I joined the company, we've been talking about Cesar. Hasn't happened yet. That has to happen if we are going to achieve the 8 to 10% reduction in carbon emissions that can come from airspace management. And we all need to play a part in that. And that's why I think it's helpful to focus on the carbon goal rather than some of the domestic political challenges that get in the way of it. We all need to make sure we get to net zero. The second is making sure that we can cope with the changes in demand across Europe. We've all experienced times, particularly in summer peaks, where we've had massive congestion across European airspace. And that's something that needs to be structurally changed. And I think over the next couple of years, even if we are not back to full volumes, because the number of markets that will be open may be quite limited, particularly this summer, we risk having congestion even on those limited routes because everyone is flying the same way. And so this all needs good planning ahead, which Eurocontrol is very good at, but also coordinating across individual national ATCs to make sure that we can deliver a seamless experience for passengers at the time when we need to give them the best possible experience.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that, John. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you agree that that was a really very interesting study of what's going on. I've recommended to people over the years that they should watch the Eurocontrol Straight Talks because it'll save you having to do an MBA in aviation management. And I think that was just the aviation policy, or sorry, the airport policy section covered right there. John, I'd like to thank you again on behalf of everyone for a really helpful and really instructive expose of what's going on from your perspective. I really enjoyed that. Interestingly, our next guest, as Eamon mentioned earlier, is Mr. Sean Doyle, who of course is normally John's largest customer and no doubt one of his dearest friends. That is on the 26th of April. I look forward to seeing you then. I hope you can join us. And until then, I wish you a very good day.